Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a great event on tap, but before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items like we always do. First off, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation, you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't hesitate. Just use the question and answer tab on your interface and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have 2 polling questions during today's webinar, so hopefully we can get everybody engaged in those. And speaking of engagement, we have a new chat feature here on the interface to allow you to chat us up at any time during the webinar. So if you have a question, comment, etc., please go ahead and use that chat interface and we will keep an eye on it. All right, and also at the end of today's webinar, we are going to be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is how to manage OPA in Kubernetes. Our speakers today are Robert Brennan, who's the Director of Open Source at Fairwinds, and Bader Boland, who's the Senior Director at Fairwinds. Guys, thanks so much for joining me today. Really do appreciate it. But before, don't get started just yet, because I want to push out that first polling question that I think is going to be very helpful in helping you guys kind of form your presentation a little bit more. I just pushed it out to the audience. The question is, where are you in your Kubernetes journey? It's a pretty simple question. You can choose from learning about containers in Kubernetes, have spun up a test cluster, have started using it in pre-production, or are using it in production. So you can go ahead and make your choice. I'm going to leave the poll open while you guys do your intros, but I am going to take myself off camera and put myself on mute so you guys can get started, and then I'll circle back when we want to talk about the poll results.
Great, thanks, Charlene. So as Charlene said, I'm Robert Brennan. I'm Director of Open Source Software here at Fairwinds. I basically head up all of our software initiatives.
And my name's Bader Boland. I'm one of the developers here at Fairwinds, and I work on our commercial product Fairwinds Insights, but also a bunch of our open source, including Polaris.
Thanks, Bader. And just to tell you all a little bit more about Fairwinds, so we are, really a company that tries to help folks build and run Kubernetes clusters successfully. We do that with a combination of software and services. So we have commercial software, like Bader mentioned. Fairwinds Insights is our commercial software platform, and it really helps folks understand, what they need to do in their Kubernetes cluster to make sure that it's secure, efficient, and reliable. And we basically apply policy and best practices all the way from CI/CD through admission control and into production. We also have a bunch of open source. Folks might have heard of Polaris as probably our biggest open source project. We also have Goldilocks, Pluto, Reckoner. We try to give back to the open source community as much as possible because we've benefited so much from it. And then last, but certainly not least, we have a lot of services around Kubernetes. We have a really highly skilled team of SREs here at Fairwinds who work hand in hand with our clients to help them build Kubernetes clusters and manage those clusters going forward. Cool. So today we want to talk about OPA and how to productionize it. And I guess to start at a very high level, we can talk about policy enforcement, which is where OPA really fits in. So Bader, can you tell us a little bit about what policy enforcement is?
Before we get it, I think our poll finished. If we wanted to talk about the results there.
Yeah, we can go ahead and I can let you know the results of the poll real quick, and then you guys can dive right into your presentation. The question obviously was, where are you in your Kubernetes journey? Guys, 57% said they are just learning about containers in Kubernetes, and then 20% said that they are using in production. Another 13% said that they have spun it up in a test cluster, and 10% have started using it in pre-production. Hopefully that'll help you.
Appreciate that. We'll see it better. Tell us a little bit about what policy enforcement is.
Sure. So policy enforcement is one of those really broad terms, but it's can be any kind of policies or regulations that you have on what kind of workloads are happening in Kubernetes and just enforcing those in an automatic way. So some kind of code to programmatically make sure that what you want to happen is happening. And that could be security policies, like you don't want your containers to run as root or run as privileged, or it could be organizational specific things like we need a label on every single pod that says which team is responsible for it in case we need to contact somebody when something's breaking in production.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. So it sounds like there's several different reasons a company might want to apply policy at their organization. I heard you mention a couple security issues and a couple sort of like internal standards and practices issues. Any other reasons folks would want to utilize policy enforcement?
Yeah, it could be really anything. So you could, I think a lot of things are going to come down to security, but then you could have some performance reasons for enforcing policies, such as wanting to make sure the requests and limits are set on all your workloads so that everything isn't just having a free for all for the resources in the cluster, but Kubernetes can actually have the information it needs to properly schedule things out.
Cool. Cool. And now, who would you say is involved in policy enforcement decisions? Who's putting those policies into place? Who's affected by those policies? Tell us a little bit about that.
That's one of those things that I feel like is very individual based on the organizations. I feel like if you're an organization big enough to have an enterprise security department, then they're going to want to have a big hand in setting what the policies are as far as security practices go. If you have an enterprise architecture group, they might care about policies around traceability, what part of the organization is creating this workload, who to contact, stuff like that. Or if you have a cloud group, they might have policies around keeping things reliable in the cluster and taking work off them. But then ultimately, all of those policies are going to come back to the developer. So making sure that the developer knows what the policies are and when they're not following them is going to be critical because ultimately people can set all the policies they want. And if the developer doesn't know that a policy exists, they can't follow it. And so it's as good as not having anything.
Cool. So it sounds like it touches a lot of different personas. I imagine, communication and process are big parts of a policy enforcement strategy.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's where it gets back to getting that information in an automatic way into as many people's hands as possible is just critical for making sure those policies are followed.
Cool. Now, when would you say an organization should adopt policy enforcement? Should it be early in their journey? Should it be, only for more mature companies?
I feel like it's one of those things that you should have some policy enforcement right out of the gate because there are plenty of best practices that are easy to pick up or use a tool that already has those best practices built into it. And then you can get those enforced right away because when you have two workloads going back and retrofitting because you didn't realize that some particular practice was important is easy. When you have 100 workloads, that gets pretty difficult. But of course, like when you realize new needs, always add on to those policies because it's better to have to go through that work and retrofit in things than to just not have your new policies unenforced.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then, where do you see policy fitting into the development and deployment process?
As many places as possible. So this is one of those things that there's all kinds of different places you can put your policy enforcement. You could have it only when it's running in production or a staging cluster. you could have at deployment time. Kubernetes has a feature called an admission controller that lets you enforce some policy and prevent workloads from actually coming up in that cluster if they don't conform to that policy. And then CI time is always great. Get that information into the developer's hands right away. That's shifting left, lowering the cost of fixing those policies. Depending on how critical a particular policy is, the further left you want it to get it taken care of right away. But especially when you're adding a new policy, it could be helpful to start with only looking at what's in production and not doing any hard enforcement, so that you can start figuring out what your backlog of things to fix is before you just suddenly break people's deployments without warning.
Cool. It's interesting. So you're saying there's a good use case for applying different policies at different stages in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's some policies you probably want to enforce across the board, but there's other ones that you're going to want to just be more individualistic about. It might make sense to have some stricter policies on that CI end than the emission controller, because you could have third-party software that you can't control that's getting deployed directly into the cluster, and the emission controller could still stop those, but you might not have as strict as standards for that as first-party software.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. So in terms of options for actually doing policy enforcement, we've picked out 3 here, Kublinter, Polaris, and OPA. Can you tell us better a little bit about how each of these tools kind of fits into the policy enforcement puzzle?
Yeah, so we kind of have these laid out in terms of flexibility. Kublinter is really great for right out of the box. You'll have a certain set of policies, and I think you can turn them on and off, but you can only do limited customization of what is being checked there. Polaris has those rich set of best practices built in, and obviously, since I work on Polaris, I know a little bit more about what's going on there. But then Polaris also gives you an option for building your own completely custom checks, whatever it is you want to check with JSON schema. And then OPA, Open Policy Agent, you have complete flexibility to enforce whatever you want. You are essentially programming these policies. It's DSL called Rego, but because of that flexibility, it's also there's nothing they can really offer you out of the box, because it's just a multi-purpose tool. So you have to provide everything, all the policies you want to enforce yourself there.
Cool. So it sounds like there's a pretty natural trade-off between power and level of complexity.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's true of anything with technology. The more flexibility you have, the more powerful it is, and also the more effort it is.
Cool. Makes a lot of sense. Cool. Well, let's dig into OPA a little bit. So OPA, for those who don't know, is a CNCF graduated project. It's one of maybe a dozen or so projects that have reached that top tier of the CNCF. As Vedder was saying, it's a general purpose policy engine. It's about as flexible as it comes. It can check not only Kubernetes resources, but Docker files, Terraform, anything along those lines. Basically anything you might want to apply policy to, OPA can get in there. And it really enables you to write policies that are both context aware and can be applied in many different contexts. So anything from CI/CD to running inside of a Kubernetes cluster. It's as Vedder said, a very flexible framework for writing policy. And so Vedder, tell us a little bit about how OPA fits into each point in the development and deployment process here.
Yeah, so like I was saying earlier, you can apply policies in a lot of different places, and kind of went with this build, deploy, run to talk about those stages. And for OPA, they have some projects specifically for tying into these steps. So at CI time, there's a tool called comp test, which is just general purpose tool for checking YAML or JSON against a set of policies. So you could easily tie that into your own CI process. At deploy time, OPA has an admission controller that they call Gatekeeper that you can add your policies to your Kubernetes cluster and have those enforced right when something's trying to get deployed. And that is something that I don't think they support warnings, because that's a kind of new feature in Kubernetes admission controllers. But at the very least, if you really don't want something to happen, you can put those hard enforcement right there in the cluster. The runtime scanning what's currently running in your cluster, that's one of those things that I haven't found any good OPA projects for handling those yet. If anyone else knows of something like that, I'd be all ears. But if you wanted to go with just straight OPA, you'd probably have to build your own process to query the cluster, pull out the YAML, and then run those against something like comp test.
Cool, that makes sense. Cool. Let's dig into what OPA actually looks like when you're writing these policies. So we have a sample policy here. Better, can you take us through kind of the steps of the Rego policy that we see here?
Yeah, sure. So this is what Rego looks like, and like I said, it is a programming language. It's somewhat based on Go syntax, but unique, which is good and bad. So I forgot, I was going to look up for sure the terminology. I can't remember for sure if they call these rules or policies. I think it's rules, though. These are the things that you want to check, and one Rego file could have multiple rules in it. They're named, and then they have a return value. In this case, this action item is the value that's getting returned by this rule. If that is nil or null at the end of the execution, then the rule passed. There's no problem. If it actually finds something, if something's actually set to that, then then the rule failed. The first weirdest thing about Rego that takes so long took me a long time to get used to, is that a lot of the normal constructs you have in a programming language, like if loops and for loops, are kind of implied. So in this case, not doing a good job of the drawing. We have this check here, checking if the input's namespace is equal to the string evil. And we just have that comparison there, no if statement or anything. Rego implicitly kind of makes each statement an if, because that's what you would expect with policies, that you would have a lot of if statements. And if you actually had normal indentation, that would be a mess to read. So instead, every statement that is true, it moves on to the next line. If it's false, then it skips the rest of the rule. So if the namespace is true, then the action item variable gets set to this map that we're creating here with a title, description, some values that you can describe the failure.
Very cool. We have a little bit more of a complex example where we can go through this, in a little bit more depth. Can you take us through this policy better?
Yeah. So this one is definitely more complex. The first thing that you'll notice is, in addition to the rule down here, there's also a function declaration, and I am really not doing a good job drawing with the mouse. That's okay. So it looks almost the same, except instead of square brackets, it has parentheses for the parameters. These functions will not be called automatically with every input like a rule would. Instead, it's something you have to specifically call. It's just a helper function. So here is where we're actually calling it at the start of our rule. We want to know if something does not contain, and using another special function. This one's built into the OPA support that we have with Fairwinds Insights. It queries the Kubernetes API. If you're using Gatekeeper, it has a somewhat similar way to do the same thing, slightly different syntax, but you can query for an API group and kind and return those objects. I mentioned that if statements are implied, for loops are also implied, which once again takes a little getting used to. But here, this first line of our function, we are looping through all of the HPAs. That's what this underscore implies, that we want to, for each value in the HPAs set, we want to pull out one of the values, set it to this HPA variable, and then start processing through. So this is trying to find any HPA that matches everything in this element, finding that and a horizontal pod autoscaler actually exists. And then if it actually finds something, this returns true. If it completely fails, it'll return false. And then we're doing a not to take the inverse of that. And this time, instead of setting an entire object, we are just returning a string here, HPA not found. That was mostly because this slide is getting kind of long.
Cool. So yeah, it seems like OPA is very powerful here. I think the idea of being able to hit the Kubernetes API and retrieve things dynamically is really cool, and this ability to kind of split out reusable functions is also really neat.
It is an incredibly powerful tool, and most of the documentation is really good for any of the simple use cases. At the margin, there's going to be little things that are hard to figure out how to do with Rego. And it's always helpful to just find other people's examples to dig into for that.
Cool. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of OPA. You talked a little bit before, Better, about how OPA can be applied for more than just Kubernetes resources. Tell me a little bit about what else OPA is good for.
This is one of those things that is really great about OPA. It's kind of the same way that, same reason that Terraform's really taken off, is that it's not a Kubernetes thing. You can check any JSON file, any YAML file, which is already cool enough. But from there, there's also all kinds of other applications for it. The one that surprised me the most, and I haven't dug into exactly how to do this, but there's a way to tie it into your SSH daemon. So you can apply policies on who can SSH into your machine. And that is just really cool to me, that like this same syntax that, oh, I just want to check that this configuration file is right. I just want to check this Kubernetes object. Oh, I also want to prevent people from SSHing into my machine. And it's all Rego. So like that's one of the biggest benefits of OPA, that after you learn that syntax, you can apply it to all kinds of problems. And I highly recommend you check out their website. I can't remember for sure all the things that it can be used for, but I think that it can be checked against like Terraform code and what's happening in your cloud environments and all kinds of stuff.
Very cool. So yeah, I'm definitely sensing a theme here of just extreme power and extreme flexibility. It sounds like OPA can really be used in any kind of environment. It can be used against any kind of resource. That's really cool to see.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I think for balance, it would be good to talk a little bit about the challenges of OPA as well. Can you talk a little bit about the complexity that is involved in creating that much power?
Yeah. That flexibility is the greatest benefit of OPA, and it comes with it the greatest cost of OPA. So you have to write Rego for everything, and hopefully you can find some open source Rego out there that's already trying to do what you want to do. But if you can't, then it's something you have to write and you have to maintain yourself. And that could be heavy, that can be expensive. It's difficult. I found it difficult to learn. I've only talked to one person that Rego just made perfect sense with his mind, and he loved it, took to it right away. Almost everybody else I've talked to, it's, oh no, this is weird because it does a lot of things that other programming languages don't do, but it still basically looks like a normal programming language. So that's a weird mental shift to get to. And I think that this last point, figuring out what policies you want to enforce, there's nothing for you out of the box. I've mentioned that a few times. So whatever policies you want, you have to figure those out yourself. And I've heard from a number of people that hear about OPA, they're like, that's great, I want to start enforcing my policies. And then when you actually talk to them, like, okay, what are your policies that you want to enforce? They're like, I don't know. You have to figure that out for yourself. And that's why I really like something like Polaris that can give you some best practices out of the box.
Cool. Yeah, so it sounds like maybe for an organization kind of early on in their policy enforcement journey, starting with a project like Kubernetes or Polaris, where you get some of those out of the box checks, maybe a little bit of flexibility in creating custom checks, and then as you mature and really have very unique use cases, sort of graduating up to OPA and layering that on top. Does that seem like a reasonable policy journey?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, we did want to talk a little bit about Fairwinds Insights, as we do have a very strong OPA integration with Insights. Basically, what we allow users to do with OPA is write a policy once and be able to run it and enforce it in a bunch of different environments. In particular, we allow the same policies to run in a CI/CD pipeline. So against your infrastructure as code as a developer or a DevOps engineer is making a pull request, we can run those policies against those changes and see if the changes would cause a new policy violation. We can run those same policies as an admission controller. So we can basically detect something if it doesn't go through that CI/CD process. We can kind of stop it at the gate and prevent that resource from entering the cluster. And we can also scan existing resources inside of a cluster, again, with the exact same policies to see, okay, what's already in there, what made it through admission control that's running in your cluster might break those policies. What's really neat is those policies can be turned on and off depending on the context. So if you have a new policy that you want to say, run against everything that's already in your cluster before, as Better was saying earlier, before actually breaking the development process, you can kind of see ahead of time, how disruptive is this policy going to be when I launch it. That can be really helpful. A little more on Insights too. In addition to OPA, we are able to integrate with Polaris and a bunch of other Kubernetes auditing tools like Trivy from Aqua Security to do container scanning. And again, we can apply those same policies across the entire development and deployment process. Cool. Well, to wrap it up, we do have another poll question here.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and push it out to you guys. The question is, what is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? You can choose from get help with the basics, general best practice assessment, implementing the right security configuration, saving money, or improving my service reliability. You can go ahead and make your choice. And as with the last one, I can go ahead and keep this poll open. You guys can continue your conversation. And then we can circle back and take a look at the poll results.
Cool. Looks like we have a lot of questions ready for us.
Good to know. I guess just to sum up before we jump into QA, OPA is a very powerful tool, but also very complex. You'll need a lot of in-house expertise to get it working right. it's important to have a story around enforcing those policies consistently throughout the development and deployment process, and software like Fairwinds Insights can help you do that. Cool. Well, let's get started on QA.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'll put myself on camera here. Let me go ahead and close out this poll, and then we'll take a look at the results real quick, and then we can dive into the questions we've got. But just a quick reminder to the audience that there's plenty of time for questions. So if you do have a question for either Robert or Bader, go ahead and use your question and answer tab and send it on in, and we will get to as many as we can. All right, the question was, what is the greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Looks like the largest percentage, 35%, said get help with the basics. It's kind of interesting. The second largest group, 31%, said implementing the right security configuration. And then about half of those, 15%, said a general best practice assessment. And 12% said saving money. And 8% said improving my service reliability. So I don't know if those results are surprising to you guys, but I would have thought actually that saving money would have been a little bit higher, but who am I? I'm not a practitioner, so I don't get the dirt under my fingernails, so to speak. But certainly it seems like a lot of folks are really closer to the beginning of their journey on Kubernetes than the ending. So I imagine that getting help with the basics is always a good place to start. So
for sure, yeah, you can tell we don't have a lot of CFOs in the room today with that.
Right, exactly, exactly. All right, well, why don't we go ahead and dive into the questions? We've gotten some great ones in so far, a lot of them. So let's dive right in. James asks, can policy be used to enforce change policies, job scheduling policies, backup restore, DC monitoring, etc.?
Generically, yes, I would say policy can be used to enforce pretty much anything. Whether OPA can do all of those things, Better, do you have any thoughts?
I was looking at that list, and I can't think of any good way to do it with change policies. Job scheduling, absolutely. If you have cron jobs, you could do an OPA policy that checks the cron schedule and makes sure that it conforms to whatever your rules are. Backups and restores. I'm thinking that I think that if you're, it depends on where your backups and restores are defined. Within the Kubernetes cluster, I can't think of anything, but like we said, OPA is very flexible to use in any kind of environment. I believe there is an integration with just AWS, so you could potentially check your RDS environment instances that they have proper backups. DC monitoring. I might be just having a kind of brain fart. All coming into mind is data center, and I don't think that's probably what you meant.
Yeah, I would say basically if you're encoding these things in infrastructure as code, OPA can definitely help you. If you're clicking around inside UIs, you're probably going to have a little bit harder of a time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, great. Next question. Jeff asks, are multiple action checks implied anded together?
So multiple lines within one of those rules are, it's implicitly anded together. If you have to meet every criteria in order to advance further. The rules, so if we go back to our sample policy, if we had one file that had multiple of these rules, they are not necessarily anded together. The results are returned individually, so you could, depending on how you're using OPA, have that flexibility to define higher level rules based on multiple things all come back together.
All right, excellent. Plenty of time for questions, guys. If you have one, go ahead and use the question and answer tab, or you can throw it in the chat area as well, and we'll just move it over for you. Cornelia asks, how do the OPA policies get enforced? In other words, how are the rules applied? For example, in Kubernetes admission controller, for example, or for that SSH example, what is the policy enforcement point?
So the OPA policies are just that Rego code, and this goes back to even more of that flexibility of OPA, is that you can use the OPA command line to just pipe in some YAML or JSON and give it a Rego policy and check what rules pass or fail on there. Conf test is a little bit higher level tool to let you check multiple policies against a particular document. For the admission controller, gatekeeper is the binary that is running your OPA policies in that case. If you're using Fairwinds Insights, then it's the Insights agent or admission controller that is handling that running. I am not positive about the SSH example. Like I said, I only kind of looked at the documentation of it. So I'm assuming that it's doing some kind of hook where your SSH daemon is calling out to the OPA binary. But ultimately, some kind of binary that can interpret the Rego is necessary for any of the enforcement.
All right, great. Next question from Jeff. Is there some kind of sandbox environment or similar to test your Rego?
I would recommend that it depends. Well, it depends on what your target environment is. If you're writing just some generic Rego, then I would recommend just downloading the OPA command line tool, and you can just pass it in whatever kind of input you want.
There is a great tool as well at I think it's play.openpolicyagent.org, which will allow you just inside of a web editor to kind of play with some examples. I think it basically just validates against JSON or YAML, so you can kind of start to get a feel for what that programming language is like, and start to develop that intuition that Better was talking about before. It takes a little while to build up if you're used to other programming languages.
Okay, John, actually, thank you, John. He put in the hyperlink to the play.openpolicyagent.org in the chat, so you can find it there.
Cool.
Awesome.
All right, thank you, John. And speaking of John, it's got a question. To scale OPA out to clusters, do you need to install the OPA binaries on each cluster, or can you centrally manage it?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say you have options here, basically. One option would be to, have a job that runs in every cluster, pulls the resources inside of that cluster, maybe ships the results out to wherever they need to be. The other thing you could do is you could give one central location access to all your clusters, maybe pull the resources out as YAML and run OPA against those. So it's really all about how, as we've been saying, OPA is super flexible. You can really do whatever you want with it. Do you want to give the same central process access to all your clusters, or do you want kind of each cluster to report out? It's really up to the user how they want to organize that.
I would also add to that in addition to the OPA binaries, how you get the Rego into all those places is also important. If you wanted to use an admission controller with Gatekeeper, you need to install Gatekeeper in all the clusters that you're going to run it in, and you also need to install your Rego policies into each of those clusters. With Fairwinds Insights, you still need to install the Insights admission controller in each of those clusters, but then you can centrally manage through the Insights SaaS which policies get enforced in each of those clusters, so that you could update them in one place and have it apply across the board to all your clusters.
All right, great. We've got a couple more questions here, but I do invite folks who have one question, go ahead and use your question and answer tab and get it on in. The next question here, Ajoy asks, as Fairwinds operates as a SaaS platform, What are the other different deployment models that can be used? Is there a self-hosted option?
That's a great question. Better's actually been hard at work on our self-hosted deployment, and we are beta testing it now. So if you're interested in self-hosting Fairwinds Insights, definitely get in touch with us. We'd love to have you test it out. In terms of just like kind of the general deployment model of Insights, I can talk to the architecture a little bit. Basically, the way it runs is we have an agent that runs inside the Kubernetes cluster that will run cron jobs, typically on an hourly basis, gather information about the cluster, do all sorts of security scanning, things like that, and report back to the Insights SaaS, which is centralized. And then we can, process, normalize that information, and put it in front of the user, send it alerts to Slack and Datadog, et cetera.
All right, great. Next question here. What are some policies that everyone should have in place?
That's a great question. I can think of a handful off the top of my head. I would say security policies are probably the first thing that folks should be putting in place, making sure that containers aren't running as root if they don't have to, that they don't have, extra access to basically like the host node's resources. A containerized process should hopefully be totally separate from the underlying machine that it's running on. That really gives you a good separation of, that application from all the other applications running in your cluster. So having those types of policies in place is super important. And then I would say there's some other sort of very basic policies around like making sure that memory and CPU limits are in place, making sure that deployments are setting liveness and readiness probes so Kubernetes can tell if your application crashed or if it's still up and running. But anything you want to add to that? Any other policies that you think are kind of a no-brainer for everyone to install?
Those were some really good ones. You mentioned specifically memory and CPU limits. I always come back to requests being more important because limits will prevent your CPU usage from running away or you having a memory leak that just goes crazy. Mm-hmm. Requests will help tell Kubernetes how to actually schedule your workload, and they also give you a little bit of inbuilt protection from noisy neighbors. I have run into way too many workloads that have just gotten crushed by a noisy neighbor that I would say at least a small request of CPU guarantees that your workload has something to work with.
Cool, that's a great point.
All right, great. Let's see, we have two more questions here that I can go through. So as I said before, if you've got a question, go ahead and get it in. We still have time, plenty of time. So next question, if you already have workloads in production that break a policy you want to put in place, how should you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is, where it's really helpful to be able to apply the same policies kind of throughout the development and deployment process and to be able to toggle those policies on and off. So what we would typically recommend folks do is start by writing the policy. Obviously, that's a good first step, and to basically scan your cluster for any resources that break that policy. And then what you can do is open an issue with those teams that own those workloads, and say, hey, we're going to put this policy in place, maybe next month, sometime in the near future. It's going to break your deployment process unless you fix this now. And you can kind of see as people fix those workloads, you can hopefully see the number of workloads that are breaking the policy go down. And then once you get down to some threshold or hit a certain period of time, you can flip the policy on in admission control or CI/CD. And folks will start seeing their build break or the deployment process break because they haven't fixed the issue yet.
I think this is also one of those things that it very much matters your organization's threshold for risk, but early on, enabling it in the CI process might be a good idea too, because it'll be annoying for those development teams, but at least you don't have any more bleed, don't have people just breaking. But I would definitely do it at the initial controller last, because then there's very little break glass situation to get around that. It's incredibly difficult. At least in the CI process, you can usually work around that if you absolutely have to, if you have some critical situation. But it's getting the CI is also usually earlier in the process so that developers have time to fix it while they're still developing on it, as opposed to they could have potentially finished work. It's been in QA for like a week, and then they go to deploy to production, and oh no, it broke if you just enabled the mission controller.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think if you get it enabled in CI, then it'll prevent new problems from arising and increasing the size of the problem over time. So that's a really good point.
For sure. Okay, gotten a couple more questions in here. Here is one regarding supporting OpenShift. Is customizing the OPA policies allowed for the OpenShift 4.x version? It says Red Hat is not for customizing inside OCP clusters.
So I think I'm understanding the question, and once again, OPA is so flexible that I don't have any real experience with OpenShift 4. My experience with OpenShift stops at 3.11, and from everything that I remember there, I think using it as an emission controller might not work, but definitely checking your policies in a CI environment or querying the resources and bumping those up against OPA would work just fine. So I would say that you should absolutely be able to use OPA with OpenShift 4.
Cool.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Barty, for that question. James has a question. Do you have to write separate OPA policy at each segregated cluster or node level, such as sandbox, dev test, certification, production, DR? Also, is policies written specific to or defined for at a namespace level?
So shouldn't ever have to do anything specific at the node level, but at the cluster level, depending on how you're doing it, once again, OPA is so flexible that there's a million ways you could do things. If you're just using Gatekeeper, then you'd have to absolutely apply those policies manually to each of those clusters that you want them to. Like I mentioned before, Fairwinds Insights offers a way to centralize those policies in the SaaS so that you don't have to worry about manually applying policies in your different environments. You could just, through configuration in the SaaS, turn things on and off. And as for the namespace level, Gatekeeper, shouldn't be namespace specific, but unless you really wanted it to be, it's absolutely something you could configure to only check certain namespaces if you wanted to. I would not recommend that because it seems like it'd be a huge maintenance nightmare, but you could. If you are if you don't use something like Insights, I still recommend you find some way to centralize your Rego policies so that you can share them across those environments. Otherwise, it's going to be a big headache.
All right. All right. Well, I'm gonna we'll do one more question and then I'll close out the question and answer period. I want to give you guys a bit of a break here. Question is, how do you run the same policies in CI and admission control?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not something that necessarily works out of the box with normal OPA. Like Gatekeeper and ConfTest both speak different languages. They speak, they expect slightly different formatted Rego. We have made sure to enforce this use case with Insights. So this idea of running the exact same policies in multiple different environments is definitely tricky, and one that we support in Insights. Basically, you can, when running your Rego files, when running OPA, there are you get to specify the context that gets applied to that policy, right? You can supply what functions are built in, what the input is, things like that. So there's some work involved to kind of normalize the input depending on the environment. I would say that's probably the big thing to keep in mind is like you'll need to do some work to basically shim the same policies to work in each different environment that you actually want to enforce them.
All right.
I just want to add something that I think is pretty cool. For the insight side, in one of our examples, I showed querying the Kubernetes API, which is obviously something that only really makes sense when you're in a particular cluster, which you're not in the CI environment. So instead, we kind of have a version of that shimmed out that you could still use the same policy to query the Kubernetes API, except instead of actually hitting Kubernetes, it looks at the other YAML files in your same CI process. And that's a cool way to be able to share that Rego code, but have it work in a way that makes sense in a particular different context.
That's neat.
All right. Very, very cool. All right, guys, we are about 9 minutes to the top of the hour. I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period because we had a lot of questions. We went through a lot of questions. And frankly, I'm sure you guys are really tired now. So I'll close out the question and answer period. But that said, if you guys have a question for Robert or Bader, please go ahead and get it on in. These guys will get a copy of all the questions that come in during the webinar. And so if they don't address it during the webinar, I'm sure somebody from the organization will be more than happy to follow up with you offline to get your question answered later on. So, even though we're closing our question and answer period, by all means, please send in your questions. Real quick reminder also to the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the presentation, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. We will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand following today's webinar. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website. So you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars and look in the on demand section. It should be right there waiting for you. All right, before we close things out, I do want to do the drawing for the 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, our first winner today is Leslie D. Congratulations, Leslie. Our second winner today is Gerald O. Congratulations, Gerald. Our third winner today, losing track here, Manu S. Congratulations, Manu. And our fourth and final winner today is Anthony B. Congratulations to all four of you. We will be following up with you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. And if you don't see anything there, please check your spam folder. All right, guys, just double checking, make sure, yeah, I think we are all good to go. All the questions have been answered, and it just leaves it to me to thank Robert and Bader for once again another great presentation. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. As always, you guys always offer up a lot of great information, very useful information, especially for folks who are just getting started down that Kubernetes path. So thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Charlene.
Yeah, great. I also want to thank the audience for joining me today. As always, this is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.